welcome to this latest ramble around the churchyard of St Nicholas Church, Sutton. This is Palm Sunday, so it's a day that we would normally be processing within the church with palms and looking forward to the events of Holy Week and then Easter next week as well. But the sun is shining and the churchyard is looking beautiful. I walked there this morning as part of my exercise. This ramble, though, is very different. We cannot meet in person. We can't meet in person because of the current outbreak of infection and the need for all of us to stay home, protect the NHS and to save lives. My name is Jeff Richards. I'm a trustee of the Friends of St Nicholas Churchyard, and in the next 15 minutes or so I'm going to be rambling around the churchyard with you, showing you bits and pieces that may educate, inform and, I hope, entertain you. Now, if you have heard of the Gibson Tomb, this is the Gibson photograph of the Gibson Tomb that you can see on the left there. You've probably heard of it in the context of the odd tradition of the annual inspection. That's a ritual that has been freaking out new rectors of Sutton since the 18th century. It is a very strange tradition. Now, we're not actually going to open the door of the tomb today and step inside. We're going to save that until next week. I'll take you in and we can play the game of trying to fit 9 bodies into 7 coffins. We'll do that, I think, next week. But if you are wandering around using the hours exercise that we are currently still allowed to have, then as you walk out, you'll find the Gibson Tomb in position 3 in this little handy map of the churchyard. It's at the western end, in that southwestern end of the churchyard, where number 3 is on the diagram. Basically, it is this big white rectangle of Portland stone. It's a big sort of square thing with a pyramidal top. The corner works are rusticated and there is a stone urn at the top of that. Now, there is a proper architectural term to describe those rusticated corner bits. They are called vermiculated angle coins. So I expect you to use that phrase now to impress your friends during the course of the next week. Now, there is an inscription above the door to the tomb, to the memory of James Gibson, late merchant and citizen of London. And when it was first built, the tomb had railings around it. So those railings, though, were removed, I think, during the Second World War, so that they could go away and be part of the war effort. Now, going back to really thinking about the Gibson family, we know very little about the Gibson family and we know very little about James Gibson. He is described as being different things. So at different times, he was a sailor, he was a distiller, he was a wine merchant, he was a miller. He was the master of the Worshipful Company of Ironmongers. And the Worshipful Company of Ironmongers is one of the 12 great livery companies of the City of London. And James Gibson was master of the Ironmongers in 1771. But there is still this mysterious sense of what is the link between the Gibson family and Sutton. Now, there may well have been part of his family, the Gibsons, living in Sutton earlier in the century, or at least being buried in Sutton. So there's an Elizabeth Gibson who was buried in Sutton and you can see here, I've got a photograph of the actual register of her burial. And so she was buried, and I presume she was dead when she was buried. It is bad form to go around burying people before they die, but she died in 1736, and then during the rest of the century there are records of other Gibsons being in Sutton. But the interesting thing is, between 1736 and 1776. So that's 40 years, and there are 7 Gibson family burials, but there's no Gibson baptisms, and there are no marriages recorded in that 40-year period. So Sutton is only a place where the Gibsons stow their dead. Now the tomb, if we have a look at, my slide is not moving on as I want it to move on. If I move on and look at the next thing, we've got the tomb for James Gibson. That was erected by his daughters his daughters were called Mary and Elizabeth in 1777. So it was a year after he had died, and you can see that there's a painting showing the churchyard as it was shortly after the tomb was completed. It's not the same church. You'll notice that it's not the same church as the one we have today. That's the new church, which was completed in 1864. And so this is actually not going to be part. The history of the church is not part of today's ramble, because we would actually go on several rambles discussing the history of the church, because we can actually go quite a long way of recovering what the ancient medieval church looked like from descriptions like this, and also other plans and things like that we've got. But anywho, if we move on, the London Metropolitan Archive holds a faculty drawing dated 1776 for the mausoleum. Now, I've not actually seen that faculty drawing yet, but I know it exists, and there would have been a faculty, which is a permission from the church courts to allow the monument to be built. Interestingly, the monument itself may not have been London Archives. There is a document called Citation and Intimation to Rector and Others of the Parish of Sutton, Surrey, to show cause why a faculty should not be granted to Mary Gibson and Elizabeth Gibson to raise a memorial to the memory of their family in the parish graveyard. So I wonder whether they objected to the vermiculated angle coins, or whether this was a more general objection to the Gibson family using Sutton as their burial ground when they didn't live in the parish. And the daughters of James Gibson, they certainly didn't live in the parish. We know that they lived in Hampstead, some 15 miles away on the other side of London. Nowadays, some people wouldn't be seen dead south of the river, but back in the 18th century, that was obviously not the case. They were quite happy to be seen dead in Sutton. Now remember, James Gibson was a merchant. The 17th and 18th century was a revolutionary time in English and British society. In 1688, the Catholic king, James II, had been overthrown and replaced by his Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband, William of Orange. This was there was during their time a massive growth in trade, and so merchants and overseas colonial interests really came to the fore. Merchants like James Gibson saw their work in building the trading power of Britain, and that's Britain because it's Scotland and England, because the parliaments had been united in 1707. Not only was it in their personal interest, but they saw it as part of national pride and also Protestant identity. And you notice of him about being a distiller. Well, when Dutch William, or King Billy, came to England in 1688, he encouraged gin distilling over the importation of Catholic French brandy. Gin was good and Protestant, brandy was nasty and Catholic. And he was a wine merchant as well. If you were going to import wine, you had to go and get it from Portugal, who, although they were Catholic, had the good sense of not being Spanish or French. Now, the Lord of the Manor, and I'm going to keep the ship up for the moment because the Lord of the Manor, and this is an East India man, the ship that you can see. The Lord of the Manor in 1736 was a man called Henry Cliff. Now, in 1736, that's when we have the first tentative connection with the Gibson family in Sutton. Henry Cliff's father, also Henry, had been an East India Company captain. And he had made his fortune in trading with the East and had bought the manor in 1716. So this is way before Clive of India had made shaking the banyan tree fashionable, in terms of that's a phrase meaning making your incredible amounts of money out of the East India Company. Now, the Lord of the Manor and James Gibson were therefore from the same moneyed mercantile class. They were both sea captains. They both yearned for a place in society, a position of respect, and in the case of the Cliff family, that had been through the acquisition of land and the position as new gentry. For James Gibson, he was interested in getting a family vault that would secure his family's posterity. And there's another clue as to why Sutton should provide a link to the Gibson family, why there should be. I'm going to look at another grave. And here you can see this grave. Now, it does look at first glance, if you see the skull and crossbones, like it's a pirate's grave. It's not a pirate's grave. And actually this grave itself could be the subject of another big ramble. But I'm showing it because this is the grave of a lady called Elizabeth Beauchamp. She died in 1716, and she was 32 when she died. And she had been the wife of a chap called John Beauchamp, who was a citizen and vintner of London. So again, a prosperous merchant, and vintner, person who sells, imports and sells wines. Vintners and wine merchants are very prominent within the history of Sutton. If we ever go and talking about the windows of Sutton, the windows of St. Nicholas, you'll see that there's a lot of vintners in trade here as well in Sutton. Sutton during the 18th century was growing. It was still, though, a village in James Gibson's time of around about 600 people, no more than 600 people. And although we don't have much in the way of evidence of great houses in Sutton, Carshalton is much better for that than Sutton. There would have been new houses and parks created from the 18,000 acres that make up the ancient parish. And the people with money, well, they always attract people who want to sell them stuff. Now, I'm going to give you a side note. Let me show you this tomb. This tomb is a tomb of, and this tomb itself could be the subject of another ramble. This is the grave of a lady called Cecil Talbot, or Cecile Talbot. She died in 1720. Now, it's probable that the Talbots had settled in Sutton because it was a very convenient location for her husband, Cecile's husband, who's Charles Talbot, his work in the courts while their main family estates were actually in Wales, in Glamorganshire. Now, I'm mentioning her because Charles, her husband, who lived in Sutton, was Solicitor General in 1726, and he has the honour of being remembered as one of the authors of something called the York Talbot slavery opinion in 1729. So this is where my talk is getting a little bit dark. The opinion had been sought from this chap called York and Talbot. Talbot is our family here in Sutton, to determine the legality of slavery in England. And in 1729, Mr. Talbot said that it was legal. And this is the York and Talbot. Let me read this to you. We are of the opinion that a slave coming from the West Indies to Great Britain or Ireland, with or without his master, doth not become free, and that his master's property or right in him is not thereby determined or varied, and that baptism doth not bestow freedom on him, or make any alteration to his temporal condition in these kingdoms. We are also of opinion that his master may legally compel him to return again to the plantations. So what has slavery got to do with James Gibson? Well, actually, everything. Everything. It was a reality in Sutton that there were chattel slaves. And here, the baptism records for 1734 from St. Nicholas Church contain a very stark record. 1734, September the 5th, Linley, a black, belonging to Mrs. Smith by the name of Samuel. That's 5 years after Cecil Talbot gave his, or Cecil Talbot's husband gave his opinion about the legality of slavery, and 2 years before we have the first Gibson mentioned in church records. And do you remember that James Gibson was the master of the Worshipful Company of Ironmongers? His maritime interests, his trading interests, link him at least into something called voyage iron. Now that's metal forged in Europe, the bars of which then acted as currency along the west coast of Africa. So that was the mechanism, one of the mechanisms by which slaves were traded from the coastal tribes, from the tribes inland, sourced from the slaves sourced from the inland tribes. So the same metal that enabled the shackles to be forged for the chains that bound the slaves, and the equipment that was used in the plantation of the Caribbean and Americas, was all part of James Gibson's industry. Now, I wonder if you find any irony in singing Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves, Britons never, never, never will be slaves. Or I think I might have got that a little bit wrong. But that was composed by Arne in 1740. 1740, that's 4 years after the Gibson family started to become involved in Sutton, and the British slave trade peaked at around about 1770 and 1797, just at the period when James died at the peak of his own prosperity. Now, his daughter Elizabeth died in 1786, aged 46, and in her will she left £500 for the maintenance of the tomb, with instructions that the interest be spent on shoes and stockings for the poor people of the parish, poor people and children. And to give you a sense of the value of money, that £500, what that meant is that there was a chap called George Stone who was appointed curate in the year that James Gibson died, 1776. This was a curate who was a graduate of Trinity College, Cambridge. So you're thinking Oxbridge candidate. What do they earn? He was paid £35 a year. Not a lot of money. And the priests then were considered to be, these were good, respectable places for opportunities for development, and it was a respectable place in society. His other daughter, Mary Gibson, died in 1793, and her remains lie with her sister and parents and other relatives in the vault. Now, Mary left another £500 in trust for the maintenance of the tomb, which was actually given to the trustees of Christ's Hospital, and that was originally in the City of London, but is now in Horsham. Now, the interesting thing, the outline of every bequest that has been given historically to the people of Sutton is recorded on the charity boards inside the church. So you can actually look at these inside St. Nick's when it's open and to be able to see that. The money is also used to pay for a sermon to be preached, with the parish clerk and church warden supposedly to be paid. They haven't been paid for years and years and years. They do it because they care. The church still inspects the tomb every 12th of August, and there is a sermon preached in accordance with Mary's will. It is all very strange, but I think I've just about run out of time. I have gone on. I ramble on too long, so I'm going to come back to the tomb again next week. Next week I'm going to take you in to the tomb so we can count the coffins and see what happens actually when the tomb is inspected. We'll also look at some of the legends and myths that have surrounded the tomb. I've just about shaken off the fear that was instilled in me when I was a choir boy, that a giant toad lived inside the tomb, and a toad that was capable of devouring small children just as easily as a toad can swallow a fly. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me on this ramble. I look forward to seeing you again next week at the same time and in the same place. So long. Your history, Sutton.